All right, let's talk Las Vegas Raiders. This is a team that's obviously gone through a big transition this offseason. They've made a lot of really smart moves, and we've covered them in depth on this channel. But now that the draft and the undrafted free agent cycle is behind us, we can take a step back and evaluate what the Raiders did, especially over the past couple weeks. And folks, when you look at the data, it's really an incredible job by SpyTech, Carroll, the entire Raiders organization. We'll get to this latest report in just 1 second. But first, I'm Nick, that is Andrew, and this is Saturday Morning Inspection. All right, when it comes to the Raiders this offseason, and like I said, we've talked about this a lot, is that there's a clear change in Las Vegas. They're making the moves to make this a more stable franchise, to go back to winning those 8, 9, 10 games, and then eventually build the talent to make a real legitimate playoff run. They've been doing a lot of great things to fill out their roster, a lot of really solid roster moves through free agency, through the coaches they've hired, front office decisions, and of course through the draft process. But we can actually look at the data now, and not only have the Raiders been doing a good job in terms of finding value and building a value-oriented team, a modern NFL franchise, they've actually done a better job than anybody. Let's go ahead and pull up our first chart here, and we're going to talk about total draft value. So what we did is we looked at each and every team's draft pick, and we evaluated where they were selected versus their ranking in the PFF big board. And if you got more value, i.e. you picked a team after they were ranked, you have a higher score. You add up that for every single one of the draft picks, and that's your total draft value. And you can see here on the screen in front of you. Now, obviously, this isn't all 32 teams. It would get kind of busy. We just did a sample. We have the best and the worst and a lot of people in between. So just that way you guys can see exactly what's going on here. And you can see based on that red arrow, the Raiders are on the far left. They got more draft value than any other team compared to their draft position. In fact, the only team that was even remotely close, and this is probably a little bit bittersweet, is the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, I know obviously Chiefs, bitter rival, one of the great rivalries in sports, so they're a really good football team, but that last sentence is what's really important, Raiders fans, is that now the Raiders are making moves like the Kansas City Chiefs are doing in terms of finding value, building a football team. And as much as you guys hate the Chiefs, and rightly so from a rivalry perspective, the fact that you're making decisions that rival Kansas City is a great sign for the future of this franchise. Again, this is an absolutely bonkers amount of value. Look at where the Raiders are compared to the rest of the league, right? You can see most of the league is actually below zero. A few teams are right around middle of the pack. The Las Vegas Raiders are significantly above zero, well over 600 points of draft value. An incredible job by the Raiders front office. This is just you don't see this very much, guys. Again, you can see how most of the time the NFL is below zero. In fact, let's go into our second chart here to kind of highlight just where the Raiders got in terms of draft value and the league average. Now, if you're wondering why the league average, you can see it right there, it's about minus 250. Why is that below? Why is it negative? Why is the average so low? Remember, a lot of teams draft for fit. So let's say if you need a running back really badly and you're drafting number 30 overall or whatever, and there's no first round running backs left, you may have to take a second round running back in the first round, right? You have to reach a little bit. For 90% of their teams, 90% of their picks are reaches, right? And I don't think that's a good mindset to have drafting for need, but that's just what happens. Teams like, hey, we need a receiver, we need a defensive end, whatever it may be, and where they are in their draft, there's not one available, they can't trade back, so they reach, right? That's why so many teams have a negative value, and winning teams over time generate positive value, because if you're trying to build a winning football team, you need a lot of good football players, but you can't overextend yourself. If you overreach too much and do it too periodically, eventually you'll end up with a situation where you don't have a talented roster. That's why the Kansas City Chiefs, one of the things they're so good at, obviously Patrick Mahomes, of course, helps, but it's the fact they have a well-rounded roster. That's why they're so tough to beat. They have very few key weaknesses. They're not great anywhere except maybe Mahomes, but because they have a lot of depth and they generated a lot of value, they can be really tough to beat, especially in those close games. The Raiders are following that exact same track. They've got a lot of great positions addressed. Geno Smith seems to be a really solid pick in terms of what they're going to be at the quarterback position for the near and medium term. Obviously, Pete Carroll's a good coach. You look at their draft in general, a lot of really good picks. But when you take a step back and just holistically look at the value and the strategy the Raiders have used here, it's indicative of, again, a transition in Las Vegas. And now this is a team on the move that's going to take those steps, go from being, hey, a 5, 6, 7 win team, hey, maybe they go on a good run, maybe they just have a magical season, to a team that's value oriented, to a team that's well rounded, to a team that's going to consistently win 8, 9, 10, and then eventually more games. The Raiders organization this entire offseason has proven they're undergoing a major change, and it's in a positive direction. All right, Mize, I'm curious what your thoughts are on all of this. But first, Raider Nation, your turn in the comment section below. Now that you've seen the data, now that you've seen the entire draft in its entirety, especially compared to the rest of the NFL, how would you grade the Raiders draft performance? Do you think it was an A-plus draft? You think they knocked it out of the park? Do you think it was a terrible draft for some reason? Maybe you got some opinions there and think it's an F or something. Maybe you're in a wait and see kind of mode, which is very fair. You're like, hey, listen, it's still May, right? Let's wait till at least the regular season and maybe at least a few years before we grade the picks. But give us your feelings overall and a grade for the Raiders draft in the comment section below. But Mize, I will toss it over to you now. What are your thoughts now that we have the data in front of us for the Raiders?
Yeah, Nick, the data kind of corroborates exactly what I was seeing when you look at this Raiders draft. And, some people hate it. We like it, but we like to look at PFF and see, their draft boards. They do a lot of great work with their draft stuff and see where they got people ranked versus where they were selected. And if you go through the Raiders' 11 picks that they made, which is a decent amount of picks, 6 of their players, I would say they drafted, the best way to say it, for value. They drafted them where they were rated a higher position. They were supposed to go earlier than where the Raiders had drafted them. So they got 6 of their 11 picks were value picks for the Raiders. And that's phenomenal. That's over 50% hit rate on value. Now, we're not saying those are going to necessarily convert, but I would say when you draft for value, more likely than not, you're going to hit versus when you, like you alluded to, reach for a player. If you go for value, that means, there's a consensus around the league. There's a consensus around a lot of places that this certain player is, supposed to be in this certain spot. And a lot of times that works out really, really well. We've seen in the past with numerous other teams, when you draft for value, when you get steals, those players tend to more likely or more often than not, be good players. So the Raiders, really smart approach here, and I really like what's going on with Spytek, Brady, everybody involved in this Raiders organization. And I think the most important thing we've seen out of the Raiders is what they did not do. I think what we've seen the Raiders do in the past, everyone knows I talk about Raiders draft. The one thing that instantly comes to your mind is, oh, the Raiders always used to draft like the fastest person in the draft. Look for the lowest 40 time, and that was going to be one of the Raiders picks. Something that throughout time had been synonymous with the Raiders. They don't do that anymore. We think about what were people linking to the Raiders this draft. Shedeur Sanders, that was somebody, the Brady connection there. That was something that people were like, okay, this is a Raiders team, probably going to go get him. They had multiple chances to, but instead they stuck to their plan. They drafted value-wise, and I think that was a really good approach. I think it shows this team's discipline. I think it shows that there's a lot of intelligence between Brady and Spytek brain trust that's going on there, and I like what they have going on here. I really think they've gotten a lot of strong players. Some guys are under the radar. Some guys they're not the top sexy names in the draft, but they waited to get them at a position of value. And I think that's going to do very, very well for them. And even in their first pick, in the first round at number 6, they got value. Ashton Gianti, he was proposed to go like a top 3 player in the league, and they got him at 6. So value there, even in the first round at pick number 6. How hard is it to get value at pick number 6? It's pretty hard, especially since only one quarterback went in that grouping. So usually you get value in the top 5-6 picks if there's a bunch of teams, like you said, drafting for need, going after quarterbacks. Not the case here. The Raiders were even able to get value in a top 6 pick, which I think is really, really great for them as well. But just overall, like you said, this is a Raiders team doing a lot of good things. They're building a strong team. And you see it right behind them on their heels. Kansas City Chiefs, their team, doing the same thing. So their ability to just get one up on them just a little bit better, that's going to help them win this arms race. They're going to have to keep continuing to do well to drive the Kansas City. Kansas City's been very tough the last couple of years. Everybody knows that. It's a strong team. Patrick Mahomes is a great quarterback. But if the Raiders keep up this plan, if they keep going with this mentality of how they're going to draft players, I think that's what eventually puts them over the edge in this new regime, and Spytek and Brady and what they're bringing to the table here, along with Pete Carroll as well. I don't want to, neglect him. I think he has a really good history of drafting value and drafting underrated players as well. I think that this Raiders team is setting themselves up for something very special. Now, I'll keep an eye out because I think the draft is going to be something very, very powerful for the Raiders for years to come.
And it also fits what the Raiders have done this entire offseason, and that's what's really important. One of the things that can happen with teams, and we see it every year, and the Raiders have been guilty of this in the past, and a lot of teams have been, is they have a certain strategy for filling out their coaching staff, a certain but different strategy for attacking free agency, and then a certain but different strategy for going through the draft, right? You can't have all these different approaches. You have to, if you want to be successful, have a unified theory of team building, roster management, and it goes through every step of the chain. Hiring, firing coaches, cutting, signing players, and then drafting players or not drafting players, right? You have to have a consistent approach. And if you look at what the Raiders have done this entire offseason, it's predicated on two things. Guys who have won games before, right? We've seen that, of course, with their entire coaching staff. We've seen that with the playoff hires they brought in, their playoff guys who have started playoff games. You look at, of course, Geno Smith, Jeremy Chin. Across the board, the Raiders have brought in a lot of postseason experience, a lot of quality veterans, but at good discounts, right? Geno Smith, they got for a steal based on his PFF rating. And again, people that hate PFF, whether it's for NFL or college, look, you're allowed to hate it, but the guys over at PFF, it's just raw data analytics, right? It's not some guy's opinion about a big board or anything like that, which is what 99% of them are. Opinions may be right, they may be wrong, but personally, I like the data. I like the analytics because at least it's unbiased, and that's what we're looking for, and that's what we like to use PFF. But the Raiders, again, they got great value based on the analytics that work through free agency, guys that know how to win. And through the draft, what do? It's kind of hard to find winners in the draft because they haven't played NFL football yet. So you have to be focused on value. And that's exactly what the Raiders did. Every step of the chain this offseason, that's what they've gone after. They've done an incredible job. A lot of people look at this Raiders team and they're still kind of sleeping on them a little bit. And I understand why, right? This was not a good football team last year. I know they were hounded by injuries. The quarterback position was really tough by the end of the season, undeniably so. But the reality is, if you look at this roster and you look at the upgrades they've made across the board before the draft, and now you can go through the draft and realize, holy smokes, they got a lot of really good football players. And that's the other thing, too, about value picks that people need to understand. It only works if you get good players. And the thing about using PFF's data in terms of big board versus where they were selected, if it's a bad football player, you're not going to actually get a lot of value. That's one of the myths there, right? If you get a guy who stinks and he's there in the 7th round or something like that, you're still not going to get a lot of value. The reason you get a big delta in value is because you got a good football player much later. You got a 2nd-round talent, good player in the 5th round. That's how you get the numbers like the Raiders did, right? If you get like a 4th-round player in the 5th round, you're only going to get like that much on the chart we showed. You get these big numbers when you get a lot of value, and that's exactly what the Raiders did this entire offseason, and it continued through the draft. The trajectory this team is on is undeniably positive. Now, look, it has to execute, right? We got to see these young guys step up and play. This new coaching staff has to work together. There's a lot of things that need to happen, and there's a long way to go. But at this point, I think it's pretty clear, it's undeniable that the Raiders, for the first time in a very, very long time, from the top down, have a clear strategy. They're executing on it. Everyone's aligned, and so far, so good.